Okay, so this is a key to worksheet 15.2 part A, and in this worksheet you're simplifying radicals, and these radicals are all square roots. Now when simplifying square roots, and these are square root of 28, square root of 50, and so on, when simplifying these square roots, these radicals, and since they are square roots, you're going to be looking for perfect squares. All right, so you got to remember your perfect squares. And so if you recall, your perfect squares, and the smallest perfect square is 1 because 1 times 1 is 1. The next one's 4 because 2 times 2 is 4. The next one's 9 because 3 times 3 is 9. The next one's 16 because 4 times 4 is 16, and so on. So these are your perfect squares. 36, 7 times 7 is 49, 8 times 8 is 64, and so on. Okay? All right, now when simplifying these square roots, you're looking for the largest perfect square. You want to use the largest that will go into 28, all right, or 50, and so on. Okay, so let's look at the first one. The square root of 28 can be simplified. In fact, all of these can be simplified. And so you're looking for the largest perfect square that will go to 28. Now, 1 is a perfect square, and 1 goes in all numbers, right? So 1's a factor of all numbers. So look for other perfect squares that will go into these radicands. So I have the radicand 28 here, so I want to see which of these perfect squares will go to 28 evenly. And so you would say 4. Okay, so I can write the square root of 28 as a square root of, and this way you would do this, you would say 4 times 7. Okay, then you would rewrite this. See how I have the square root of a product? Then you would write this as a product of two separate square roots, because there's a property that says that if you have the square root of 4 times 7, that's the same thing as saying the square root of 4 times the square root of 7. And then what you would then do is simplify what you can. So I can simplify the square root of 4 because the square root of 4 is 2. So this becomes 2 square root of 7, and the only perfect square that goes into 7 is 1, so we're done. So the answer is 2 square root of 7. In number 2, so 50, so you want to think about, well, what's the largest perfect square that goes into 50? All right, so the only perfect squares that go into 50 is 1 and 25, right? So let's use 25 then, that's the largest. So I'm going to say that's going to be the square root of 25 times 2. Notice I always put the perfect square first. You don't have to, but it does help. And so this becomes the square root of 25 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 25 I know is 5. So that's 5 square root of 2. Okay? Now, some students make the mistake and without thinking, and they say this. Okay, so they say that the square root of 25, and they'll write square root of 5. Well, that's not true. Okay? So you can even check your calculator. If you look at the square root of 25, so square root, so remember the square root's right above the x squared button, so you have to press second square root. When you press that and put 25, press equal, that's 5. And then if you did the square root of 5, you know that's not true, because look at what the square root of 5 is. The square root of 5 is this irrational number. Okay, so that's 2.23, so obviously that's not 5, right? Okay, so you got to be careful. So you got to think the square root of 25 is 5, because 5 times 5 is 25. And the only perfect square that goes into 2 is 1, so I cannot simplify this any further. So the answer is 5 square root of 2. Okay? All right, so number 3, so the square root of 45. So you look at your perfect squares and ask yourself, what's the largest of these that will go into 45? Well, there are only 2 perfect squares that go to 45 evenly, 1 and 9. That's it. These are the only 2 perfect squares that go to 45 evenly. And so we're going to use the largest one, 9. So I'm going to write this as the square root of 9 times 5, okay? Then I'm going to rewrite this as the square root of 9 times the square root of 5. The square root of 9 is 3 because 3 times 3 is 9, right? So the square root of 9 is 3. And then the only And then you ask yourself, can I simplify the square root of 5 any further? No, because the only perfect square that goes into 5 is 1, so you're done. That's 3 times the square root of 5. So 3 times the square root of 5. Okay? All right, number 4. If you look at number 4, we have the square root of 98. All right, so you got to look at this a little bit carefully because 98 is a bigger number than the others. But 1 goes into all of them, but then you got to ask yourself, will any of these other perfect squares go into 98 evenly? All right, so use your calculator to check. All right, so for example, you have access to a calculator. Ask yourself, well, what about 4? Well, let's check. 98 divided by 4 is not a whole number, so no. What about 9? 98 divided by 9 is not a whole number, right? So what about 16? Well, 98 divided by 16 is not a whole number. And you keep on going. And obviously you're not going to say 25 because any number divisible by 25 better have its last digit being 5 or 0. All right, so let's check their 49. So 98 divided by 49 is, yep, there's a whole number, so it's 2. All right, so we're going to say that's going to be the square root of 49 times 2, right? And so the square root of 49, I can write this as the square root of 49 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 49, remember 49 is a perfect square, which means I can write the square root of 49 as 7. And then the only perfect square that goes into 2 is 1. So we get 7 square root of 2. All right, number 5. Okay, well, number 5, if you think about it, let's go a little bit further. All right, so 8, and then the next one's 81, right? And the next one's 100, right? Because 10 times 10 is 100. So 100 is a perfect square, y'all agree? So what's the square root of 100? It's just 10. 10 times 10 is 100. There's your answer, right? Okay. Now remember, 100 is a perfect square. So that means the square root of 100 is 10. Okay, now let's look at square root of 300. Which of these perfect squares besides one will go into 300? All right, now that might be several that you could think of, right? 25. Y'all agree that 25 goes into 300, right? Well, are there any others like 4? Well, let's check. 300 divided by 4. 300 divided by 4. Yep, sure does, right? But you want to use the largest because the largest will make things so much easier for you. For example, I want to show you this. For example, let's look at number 6 over here. Let me do number 6 on this page. All right, number 6. All right, so I have the square root of 300. Y'all agree? All right, and I know that 4 is a perfect square and 4 goes into 300. I agree with that. So you're going to say that that's going to be the square root of 4 times 75, right? 4 times 75 is 300. So then you're going to say, all right, well, I know that I can write this square root of 4 times the square root of 75, right? And then the square root of 4 is a perfect square, so that's going to be 2. 75 is not a perfect square, so I'm just going to go ahead and rewrite it. But then you got to ask yourself, remember, each time I did this, every time I did this, I asked myself, is there a perfect square other than 1 that goes into 7? No. So square root of 7 cannot be simplified. Is there a perfect square other than 1 that goes into 2? Nope. Square root of 2 cannot be simplified. So there's the answer. And so on, right? So then I come over here and I ask myself the same thing. Is there a perfect square that goes into 75 besides 1? Yes. 25. 25. So that becomes 2 times the square root of 25 times 3, right? 25 times 3 is 75. And then I'm going to rewrite this like I did this one. So I'm going to say that's going to be 2 times the square root of 25 times the square root of 3. And so that's going to be 2, and then the square root of 25. 25 is a perfect square, so the square root of 25 is 5. And then I'm done with the square root of 3. That cannot be simplified any further. And so I get 2 times 5 is 10. So I get 10 times the square root of 3. But the point being this, you see, I did not use the largest. every time you want to simplify a square root, it is always easier to use the largest perfect square. And the reason for that is because it saves you all of these steps. So if I use the largest, what's the largest perfect square that goes into 300? 100. We just talked about that because 100 times 3 is 300, right? So that's going to be the square root of 100 times 3. And so that becomes the square root of 100 times the square root of 3. And right away I got the answer. What's the square root of 100? 10. I cannot simplify the square root of 3, so I'm done. 10 square root of 3. So notice that how many steps you did it using the largest perfect square versus how many steps it took you if you did not use the largest perfect square. Okay? All right. Now, you could have, I want to show you, see how I use 4 here? Someone else could have said, well, I use 25. Is that okay? Sure it is. 25 is okay. It's not the largest, so you're going to have some steps here. So here's what you would say. Well, that's going to be the square root of 25. Now, on your calculator, say, well, what's 300 divided by 25, right? 300 divided by 25. Well, that's 12. Okay, I can handle that. That's the square root of 25 times the square root of 12. The 25 is a perfect square, so the square root of 25 is 5. So I have 5 square root of 12. But before you say that's the answer, you got to ask yourself, besides 1, is there a perfect square that goes into the radicand, that goes into 12? Yes, there is. 4. So I can write this as 5 times the square root of 4 times 3, right? And then I'm going to rewrite this as 5 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. And the square root of 4 is 2. So I get 5 times 2 times the square root of 3. So you get 10 square root of 3. Same thing. Okay? But remember what I said. It is so much easier to think about, well, let's use the largest. All right? And it won't be that difficult to where you will have trouble finding the largest. You have access to your calculator. Just do some division. See which one gives you that whole number that you want. All right, let's look at 48. Okay, so again, I want you to think of the largest. So let's use the largest perfect square, okay? What's the largest perfect square that goes in a 48? All right, so 1 goes in all of them, so I'm not even going to worry about that. All right, let's look at 4. 48 divided by 4. Okay, so watch what happens when I do this and think. I get 12. All right, so I use 4 and I got 12. Is there another perfect square that goes into 12? Yeah, 4. So it's this 4 times this 4, 16. So there you go, 16. Right? So I'm going to write this as the square root of 16, and then 48 divided by 16 gives me 3, right? So it'll be 16 times 3. So I get the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. 16 is a perfect square. That means the square root of 16 is 4. So I got 4 square root of 3. Now, it is okay if you didn't use the largest. No problem with that. You just got to make sure that your final answer is simplified as much as it can be. So you may say, well, I use 4. Okay, you use 4. That's fine. That's fine. It's not the largest. So you can be doing quite a few steps. So number 7, square root of 48. So let's say you used 4, right? Okay. So that'll be the square root of 4 times 12, right? And then I'm going to rewrite this as the square root of 4 times the square root of 12. 4 is a perfect square, so the square root of 4 is 2. Is 12 a perfect square? Nope, it is not. But is there a perfect square that goes into 12 besides 1? Yes, 4. So I'm going to write this as 4 times 3, right? And so I'm going to rewrite this as 2 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. Square root of 4 is 2, so I get 2 times this 2 times the square root of 3. And so 2 times 2 is 4, so you get 4 square root of 3. Okay? But it is so much easier to use the largest perfect square. All right. Now, 1/5, square root of 150, there's no difficulty there for 150, square root of 150, because besides 1, the only other perfect square that goes in 150 is what? That's right, 25. So that's going to be the square root of 25. And then you may say, all right, well 150 divided by 25 gives me 6, right? So you're going to say that's going to be 25 times 6. And then rewriting this as the square root of 25 times the square root of 6. 25 is a perfect square. The square root of 25 is 5, so you get 5 square root of 6, right? And then and now ask yourself, before you go on, can I simplify the square root of 6 further? No, because the only perfect square that goes into 6 is 1. So you're done. 5 square root of 6. All right, let's look at 80. Okay, so there are several perfect squares that go into 80, right? Okay, besides 1, there's 4 and 16. There are a couple, rather, besides 1, right? So let's use the largest. So you may say, well, I don't know how to figure out the largest. Well, yeah, you do. Let's think about that. So we have 80, right? So you know 4 goes into 80. What about 16? So 80 divided by 16, all right, is 5. And look at this. 5, the only perfect square that goes into 5 is 1, so you're done. What's the largest perfect square? 16. See, if you did 4, watch, 80 divided by 4 is this, right? Is there a perfect square other than 1 that goes into 20? Yes, 4. 4. So what's that perfect square 4 times this 4? 16. Okay, so 16. So then you would say, all right, well, let's see what 80 divided by 16 is. 5, and the only perfect square that goes into 5 is 1, so I'm done. The largest perfect square is 16. So this becomes the square root of 16 times 5, right? And so that becomes the square root of 16 times the square root of 5. And the square root of 16 is a perfect square, so that means the square root of 16 is 4, because 4 times 4 is 16. And then I cannot simplify the square root of 5 any further, because the only perfect square that goes in the radicand being 5, is 1. So you're done. 4 square root of 5. All right, 125. Again, the only perfect square that goes into 125 besides 1 is 25. So that's going to be the square root of 25 times 5. And so this becomes the square root of 25 times the square root of 5. And 25 is a perfect square, so the square root of 25 is 5. Square root of 5. And we're done. So it's not that bad. Just go back over this, how I did this, and then use the calculator to help you. All right? Use this. It does help you. Think about what simplifying a radical means, simplifying a square root means in terms of these perfect squares. And also keep in mind that when simplifying a radical, it's not incorrect to not use the largest. So you could use a perfect square that's not the largest. You just got to make sure you simplify all the way, though. Okay? All right, so that's the key to 15.2 part A.